Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Hi, I'm Dr. Roger Seheult. Over the past 4 years, we've produced top quality videos explaining concepts in medicine clearly. These courses are the product of years of experience and preparation that includes only these things. Number one, you either need to know it for the test, or number two, you need to know it to become a great medical professional.
Hi, this is John Cullen. Welcome to another episode of Heroes of the Pandemic. Allow me to introduce you guys to Dr. Roger Seheult. And Dr. Roger, could you say hello to everybody if you would?
Hello, everyone.
There we go.
Thanks, John.
You bet. It's an absolute honor and a pleasure to have you here. I'm just absolutely blown away by the work that you've done at MedCram. You're board certified in 4 different areas of medicine. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you were a chem and a bio major. You did a fellowship in pulmonary care and critical care. And so I just can't imagine anybody who's more qualified to be talking about what we're going through right now. But for the audience that may not be familiar with your work with MedCram, first of all, you've got medcram.com, and you have the YouTube channel for MedCram. And the YouTube channel recently crossed 1 million subscribers. Is that right?
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty remarkable. So the reason I love what you do is probably in the subtlety of it. For the audience, what Dr. Seheult has done, before you did this, you used to teach the medical test. You used to teach aspiring doctors how to take the medical examinations and pass and become physicians, right? I mean, you did that as a career at one point, and now with these videos that you're doing, you're sort of distilling it down to the essence of what people need to know in a manner that's understandable. And I think that's the key differentiating element, is you've done this in a way that people can understand.
Before I became a physician, I worked for a national test prep company, and I taught the MCAT and the USMLE. Now, I'm board certified in internal medicine, pulmonary diseases, critical care medicine, and sleep medicine. I still have a busy clinical practice and actually treat the diseases that I talk about. It is this experience that separates medcram.com from all the others. I know what kind of questions show up on the test because I write the test questions for medical students. I know what's important, and now you will too. Join us at medcram.com.
And I think it's allowed people to become physicians that may have struggled otherwise, because it's tough in the classroom often to understand the teaching assistants and what have you. And so I think that you may have helped a lot of people who have become great physicians become physicians. And for that, I think we're all grateful to you. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Yeah, this all started out back in about 2012. I had a physician assistant student named Kyle Allred who teamed up with me. He was actually my student, and he said to me, Dr. Schwell, people, medical students, PA students, those are physician assistants, respiratory therapists, all of these students that go into the medical field, they don't do what you did when you were in medical school. They don't go to the library and check out a journal article and have a library card and photocopy it and take it home. They go to Google, they go to YouTube, and they try to find the shortest video they can on a topic and watch that to get as much information as they can. And he's right. We probably would have done that if we had Google and YouTube back when I went into medical school. That was back in the late 90s. So what we did was we just basically made these videos, these instructional videos for students, medical students, PA students, respiratory therapy students, to learn. And it was the same material over and over again. They would come every month and we would discuss it. And so instead of spending the time to go over the same thing over and over, we just made these videos on YouTube, and they would watch these before they would come to the clinic. And then we would go over it. It's called a flipping the classroom type of thing, where instead of going to a lecture first and then going home and studying about it, you study about something before you come to lecture, and then you can fine tune that when you're actually meeting the professor one-on-one. So we did that. It was fairly successful. We had about 400,000 subscribers prior to the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit. And, we had done videos before on Zika virus and things that were hot in the news. But about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, we decided to do our first coronavirus video, and it just exploded, and our subscriber base just exploded. And so what it was is, instead of making videos that were for a audience of medical professionals or people studying to go into the medical profession, we quickly realized that our audience now had expanded to those that were not familiar with the language of medicine. And it's one of the first things you learn when you go to medical school or these kind of schools is it's a different language. And so we had to learn to kind of expand out and use language that everybody could understand. And realized that we had a much bigger audience. And so it was kind of ironic, where all of the sports stadiums were shutting down, all of the basketball stadiums, coliseums, all these things were shutting down, and the sports figures were no longer being watched. It was kind of like Revenge of the Nerds, right? It's like now, instead of the jocks being watched, it was all the nerds could now talk, and everyone was watching us, the people that were never popular in school, or, I'm kind of being hyperbolic here, but yeah.
Well, no, I mean, I talk about this often, that the big difference between me and LeBron James, besides his wealth, is that he can do this really well, right? He does this really well. And for that, he makes millions more than you. It's kind of weird, but continue. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, no. So it's like now the world was watching medicine, and we had never been in the spotlight before, and we never watched. And so you have people, for better or for worse, you have people like Fauci, you have the president of the United States, you have the health minister, you have Health and Human Services, you have drug companies, you have immunologists. People now, what they said really didn't matter before. It was kind of wonky. The people in that field and those echo chambers were listening to those people. But now you had hundreds of millions of people literally listening to these people. And what we saw, and we can get into this more, is what we saw was the science dictating what they did in most cases. And the problem with that is that the science changes. And so one day they would say one thing, and maybe a month or two later they would change their mind. And people who didn't understand this were looking at this and saying, they're waffling. It's not politics, it's medicine. And so medicine changes. And so for us in the world, we were like, well, I'd rather have somebody, kind of changing their mind, dictating as the science goes, rather than sticking to their previous idea, regardless of what the science says. And so there's a lot of interesting aspects about this whole pandemic and what's gone on in the last 12, 13 months. But I'm sure we'll get into that.
Well, the thing that upset me dramatically, and I think upset my audience dramatically, was how professionals, how doctors and PhDs and practicing physicians, epidemiologists, if they had any sort of observation that they wanted to share, it seemed that the social media companies felt that it was their role to step in and say, that's not exactly what the CDC said, and so we're going to need to eliminate your channels. And I think there were a couple doctors in California, 2 doctors that were in a conference room, and they were saying, we're seeing this and we're seeing that, and it was like it was as if they were falsely accused of having some alternate agenda or something. And I think most of the world looks at it and says, these are just doctors telling you what they're seeing. I think everybody was sort of taken aback by this and wondering what the heck is going on. Why are they shutting down all the doctors? What's with this, hush thing? What is that?
It's real. It's happening even now, as you know. Back when we were at MedCram talking about hydroxychloroquine, even before it was political, we were talking about it in March even. And then when it became political, we had a number of our videos taken down. Bloomberg had some questions about it. When I say Bloomberg, the news service did a story, interviewed us, and went to, in this case, it was YouTube, and those videos were eventually reinstated. But even to this day, we've talked about vitamin D. Vitamin D is a pretty mainstream talk. There are scientists who believe that vitamin D may be beneficial in COVID-19. There's a number of articles and studies that actually have shown that vitamin D supplementation with vitamin D is beneficial in acute chest infections. That we have that.
Why would that be controversial? I mean, got milk, right? I mean, why would it be controversial to talk about certain levels of vitamin D? I mean, why? And
I get comments from people on our channel who said, "Hey, I tried to share your vitamin D video on Facebook, and I got banned for 24 hours."
Dr. Seheult, you've advocated for vitamin D as a potential way to prevent COVID-19 infections, to prevent severe COVID-19 infections.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So we've been talking about vitamin D as a potential therapeutic agent for COVID-19 since March. And since that time, a lot of other people have become involved in looking at that agent as well. A number of research studies have been done. And the purpose... Okay, so let's talk about vitamin D. The first thing you've got to understand is that vitamin D is not just a vitamin. Vitamin D is actually a hormone. And if you notice here by the structure, you'll see that it is a steroid hormone, which means it can go into the nucleus. It can go through membranes and make effective changes.
That's crazy. Well, to me, that's why you're a hero, right? So it's that and everything else that you did up until the coronavirus. And then to stick your neck out as you've done. I mean, one of the slide I have up now is Dr. Scott Jensen. And when Dr. Jensen came forward and said, this reimbursement thing is a little bit awkward as far as, motivations to admit patients. And they went after his license for coming out with that. And so that's why I'm doing this Heroes of the Pandemic, because I just can't stand for this ad hominem attacking of physicians. It's atrocious, and it needs to stop.
We're going to have a special guest in here in just a second, Dr. Scott Jensen. I saw his thread yesterday, his video, and I thought, oh my God, I must interview him. There's a lot to get into here.
My next guest is a doctor and state senator in Minnesota who is deeply troubled by the CDC's latest guidance for counting COVID deaths. Dr. Scott Jensen joins me now.
Well, I would remind him that anytime healthcare intersects with dollars, it gets awkward. Right now, Medicare has determined that if you have a COVID-19 admission to the hospital, you'll get paid $13,000. If that COVID-19 patient goes on a ventilator, you get $39,000, 3 times as much. Nobody can tell me after 35 years in the world of medicine that sometimes those kinds of things impact on what we do. Some physicians really have a bent towards public health, and they will put down influenza or whatever because that's their preference. I try to stay very specific, very precise. If I know I've got pneumonia, that's what's going on, the death certificate. I'm not going to add stuff just because it's convenient.
So I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing. We've seen senators get shut down. We saw the former president get shut down. We've seen doctors get shut down. And all I'm going to do here is cite data from the CDC and the WHO. That's it. I don't have a theory. I don't subscribe to any theories. I just have data. That's it. You're the doctor, okay? And the data that I'm going to share with you mostly is coming from the CDC. I'm going to show you exactly where it comes from, but a bunch of other data is going to come from the WHO. But why don't I share with the audience a little bit about the agenda that we're going to cover in this show. So I guess one of the members of our mutual audience, so there's some intersection between my microscopic group of people that watch my audience and your million subscribers. And somebody said, Dr. Seheult is using the maps. He's using the maps. And I guess somebody sent you an email, one of my audience members, and reached out to you. And you and I had a little bit of email correspondence, but that's it. This is the first time we're meeting. And so you sent me a note and said, okay, what do we want to talk about? So let me just lay out the agenda for the audience so that they know what the expectations are. I sent you an email saying, well, how is it, first of all, that there's more people dead in Ohio than all of Japan? All right, so I tend to look at things a little bit differently, right? I come up with, I don't know if you're familiar with Freakonomics. All right, so I look at things in a...
My entire academic life has been devoted to figuring out tricky ways to get at causality.
We kind of say, what if this thing that everybody thinks is so really isn't so? It sounds ridiculous, but you see it all the time, people trying to fight against or build up something that they're sure is connected to something else, which it turns out just isn't.
The closest thing to worldview in Freakonomics is that incentives matter. And if you can figure out what people's incentives are, you have a good chance of guessing how they're going to behave.
They say money doesn't buy happiness. Wanna bet?
I don't have to ever have seen a sumo match. I can go in the data and I can tell you that there was rampant cheating going on.
When there's an incentive to cheat, a small percentage of people always will.
Could students increase their test scores simply by giving them a financial incentive?
$50. You are getting straight A's from me. Yes.
Clear the numbers are dropping. What's not clear is why.
The line between like economist and criminal is incredibly thin.
And what about journalists?
No line.
Oh, that is so cool.
You give people permission to challenge conventional wisdom and to ask a different kind of question entirely.
And I guess from reading their stuff, I just kind of learned to look at things differently. So I look at Ohio and I compare Ohio to Japan. I look at California and I compare California to the entire country of China, the entire country of Korea, the entire nation of Nigeria and Tanzania. And California has more dead. Now, these are not comparisons that I hear Anderson Cooper making. These are not comparisons that I hear on ABC News. Okay, so this is different. This is a different way of looking at this outbreak.
When I started my career in advertising, it was sort of on the heels of one of the most iconic campaigns in the ad game, which was the Think Different campaign that Apple put together. It talked about there's certain people that bucked convention, that did things different from the way that things were done. And because of their approach and the way that they thought differently, they were able to make some profound and fundamental changes. You can look at various behavior of some notable people in history. Albert Einstein, for example, even some historical figures like Mozart, recent figures like Amelia Earhart, even Steve Jobs. And they displayed some very classic behavior of people on the spectrum. I was reading a report that was published in the Journal of Autism and Development Disorders. It talks about how people on the spectrum are programmed to think differently. And they did a series of tests. They asked a number of people, I think there's a sampling of about 350 people, and they asked them to look at common things like paper clips and identify alternative uses for these common items. A neurotypical response to that question would have been things like a pin or a fish hook or a piece of jewelry. People on the spectrum gave answers like a ballast for a paper airplane or chips for gambling. And they found that their responses were less than 5% of the common responses of the whole sample size. So they were actually, quantitatively different. So people on the spectrum, the right side of the brain, the one that answers, as they say, for the creativity, for the common experiences, the more sort of social behavior, it's impaired. It's one of the reasons that they are the way that they are. There isn't really a social common behavior that they have. There aren't the same references that they share with people. So people on the spectrum, their left side, the more logic side, not only is it not impaired, because it's what they use more often, in some cases it tends to be more developed. And the theory that came out of this piece was people on the spectrum, they approach problem solving differently because that's the way that they're wired. I think many people remember the Think Different campaign. It talked about there's certain people that did things different from the way that things are done. And there was a 1-minute film basically celebrating that. They kind of went through and selected some iconic figures who, just through their sheer willpower or because they thought differently, changed humanity for the better. And it just so happens that many of these people that changed the face of humanity, that thought differently, were on the spectrum. As I said, including Steve Jobs, who is suspected to have had Asperger's. If you include the 18 people highlighted there, 13 of the 18 people were either diagnosed as being on the spectrum or suspected to have been on the spectrum, which is pretty amazing. And there was never a brief, at least I never read about a brief, that we're looking for people on the spectrum. They're looking for people that thought differently.
I look at comorbidities. What is the number one comorbidity? What if it was tuberculosis? As a pulmonary guy, you'd be like, what? Tuberculosis? What, are you kidding me? You mean we got a co-infection of tuberculosis? I mean, if it turned out it was something like that, or what if, 48% of the people had rotavirus? That would be kind of significant, right? You'd be like, what? How did that happen, right? You'd want to know that. So we want to look at, what is the number one comorbidity? Is it Alzheimer's? Is it diabetes? Is it something else? And then, I don't know if I'm even allowed to say the word anymore. Sex, right? The sex chromosome is what it's called, right? XX or XY. That's not a gender thing. You can be any gender you want. I'm talking about chromosomes, right? I'm all for gender fluidity. Anybody, it's all good with me. But we're talking about XX or XY. Right? And in an XXXY world, is there a difference? And if there was a difference, would you want to know about it? For example, hypothetically speaking, if twice as many women were dying as men from coronavirus, would that be relevant? Would we want to talk about that? Would we want to explore that further and understand the dynamic behind that, if that were the case? Right? And this, similarly, I guess, with race, right? If there were particular races.
We know Black people are disproportionately likely to contract the virus and die from
races that were dying at a 2-to-1 over some other race, right? If we found out that Asian Americans were dying at a prorated 2-to-1 ratio over everybody else, we'd want to know, well, why is that, right? Why is that happening? So when we look at deaths from other causes, the question becomes, well, where does COVID fit in the overall scenario of things killing different groups, right? And in particular, I've been looking at kids because of this issue of reopening the schools, right? So I ask, again, kind of uncomfortable, weird questions, which we'll get to. But, things like, I don't know, did more kids actually die from asthma than from coronavirus last year? Did more kids actually die from stroke than coronavirus last year? And if that's the case, why are we not putting that in perspective in a way that might make... So for example, I mentioned tuberculosis a minute ago. There is a vaccine for tuberculosis. I think it's called the GB... You're going to know this. You're a pulmonary guy. It's the Guillain-Barré something. It's some French name. GBC...
Yeah, it's the BCG vaccine.
There you go. There you go. The BCG vaccine. And they use it in a disadvantaged part of the world for tuberculosis, right? But why don't we use that in the United States? Why don't we vaccinate children in the United States with that vaccine? Why?
The reason is because, well, first of all, that vaccine does a very good job at preventing meningitis in young children. Meningitis from tuberculosis, that is. It doesn't do a very good job at all at preventing pulmonary tuberculosis. And it all has to do, it all has to do with prevalence. So if you look at those countries where they give the BCG vaccine, they usually have a high prevalence of tuberculosis. And so it's much more cost effective in those countries to vaccinate against the disease. In our country, fortunately, the United States, we don't have a very high prevalence of tuberculosis. And so it's much more cost effective to screen for the disease and then treat it when you find it. Now, the reason why that those are different is because when you get the BCG vaccine, it unfortunately renders your screening tool useless. So if you get a BCG vaccine, you can't do the skin test. It's going to be positive
no matter
regardless
what. Got it.
No matter what.
Got it.
Right.
Got
so we have to make a choice at the outset. If you want to do, you got to figure out, are you a high prevalence country or a low prevalence country? If you're a low prevalence country, it doesn't make any sense vaccinating. It makes a much better sense doing the screening.
Well, you just made my point. Thank you. So the question then becomes, where's the dividing line? How do we decide, right? And is it based on death? Is it based on, so for example, if I didn't know this meningitis thing, that the TB wasn't just pulmonary disaster, that it also had a meningitis component, I guess, or outcome that could be bad. So these factors that go into deciding where the vaccine will be used, in what countries are going to use it and what countries won't. The United States at some point said, there's not that many kids, I guess, that are dying. For me, that's the litmus test, is dying, right? Now, if it has permanent, if there's permanent stuff, like if you get meningitis and then you're disabled, I mean, I don't know. I mean, do you recover from meningitis without any kind of side effects, or?
Yeah, well, once you get, unfortunately, if you get meningitis, which is a rare complication, you can get some permanent problems. The real issue with tuberculosis, and the reason why they nail that one down hard in terms of screening, and they're very particular about it, especially where I live here in California, is because it can spread. It's an infectious, it's a communicable disease. Sure. It can spread to others. And so making sure that you catch an outbreak quickly, early, and make sure you treat it. Treating is another complication, because if you don't treat it appropriately, all you'll do is just make it resistant to the medicines you're giving it.
And it's complicated. Treating pulmonary tuberculosis, I think there's like 3 or 4 different medications, and it's not stuff most people have heard of. It's not Zithromax. I mean, it's complex stuff, right? You're
absolutely right. Yeah, 4 drugs typically.
I mean, that's, and it's a regimen that lasts for quite some time, right? It's not a 5-day regimen. It's months.
Yeah.
And over 1 million people are dying from tuberculosis annually, like 3,000 a day, something like that.
Right, and the real problem is that the real thing that the WHO is concerned about is the not just tuberculosis. It's the drug-resistant tuberculosis that's the real key, and it's the problem. And where are we seeing it? We're seeing it in countries that had lost their public health departments during the fall of communism. So Eastern Europe is a hotbed, or was a hotbed, of drug-resistant tuberculosis. Interesting.
Well, with that as a background for our agenda, let me sort of introduce myself to you and give you some perspective as to where am I coming from with this thing. You know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm a data guy. And over 30 years ago, while I was working at Oracle, there's a company in California that said, we want to take maps and marry them to the database. And I was the guy that went out there to do it. And I put the team together to do this. And this is over 30 years ago. So when I saw how Johns Hopkins was using my map, I said, what are you doing? That's not how you use it. What are you doing here? Something's wrong. And I became a whistleblower, and I didn't sign up for this. I didn't have a YouTube channel looking into diseases. I wasn't doing maps. I was doing other kind of investigative journalism, but this wasn't my wheelhouse at all. And then I saw the map, and I said, what are you doing? What are you doing? So I'm going to show you what I discovered as a result of being a data expert, a database expert, and a cartographer. I'm a mapping expert, okay? And I don't think they were counting on someone with my skill set to come along and look at this the way we're about to look at it. Also, I am of the belief that the FDA is not 100% perfect all the time. They've made one or two mistakes along the way, right? Zantac, right? Accutane, right? Thalidomide. I mean, we've had a number of disasters along the way. So they're not perfect. An adult conversation, I mean, that's really all this is. We're just going to talk about stuff. I was prescribed Zantac and took it for some time, right? Now, am I going to die from stomach cancer because of that? Because someone made a mistake? I don't know, right? But, right, this was pulled off the market and I was prescribed it, right? So I'm not allowed to ask questions about the medications that I'm being prescribed, right? It should be reasonable. So the kinds of questions that I've been asking are these really annoying questions like, how is it, Governor Newsom, that California has more people dead than 13 of the 20 most populated countries on the planet, including China? That's a pretty awkward question for Governor Newsom. In fact, he may not be able to bear more questions because that's a really uncomfortable question. So California has more people dead than 13 of the 20 most populated countries on Earth. That's not good. That's not good.
No.
That's not good by any measure. I'm not pinning this on you. I'm pinning this on your governor. So, California has more people dead than China and Pakistan, Nigeria with over 200 million people, Bangladesh and Japan, Ethiopia, Egypt, Vietnam, the Congo, and Thailand combined. But Governor Cuomo got the Emmy, and Governor Newsom hasn't won any trophies. How is that possible? How is it that California has more people dead than Pakistan, Ethiopia, Egypt, Vietnam? cognitive dissonance should be kicking in right now, and you should be pretty nauseous looking at this. Why was this not on CNN? Why did Anderson Cooper not point this out? Why is Rachel Maddow not reporting to you that you've got more people dead in California than all these countries combined? Don't you feel like, whoa, what? Why does Ohio have more people dead than 11 of the 20 most populated countries on Earth? Ohio. I mean, the Amish live in Ohio. I mean, they're riding horse-drawn buggies, right? And the Mennonites, right? They're still there.
Pennsylvania, too, I think.
Yeah. I mean, come on. Is it not the most densely populated state in the country, Ohio? And yet, there's more dead in Ohio than 11 of the 20 most populated countries on Earth. According to the Associated Press, influenza disappeared. Well, by way of introduction, I'm the guy that wrote the paper back in October that said, not only did influenza disappear in South Africa and Chile and the United States and Australia, but if you bother to spend another hour looking at the WHO's system, you're going to find there's no influenza anywhere on Earth except for Cambodia and Vietnam. It's gone. And it disappeared at the same time pretty much everywhere. Week 11 to week 12, influenza disappeared. Now, the CDC published a paper saying it went away in Chile, South Africa, Australia, and United States. And I read the paper, and then I went to the website for the WHO. And I said, yeah, what about Sweden? What about Switzerland? What about Iceland? What about Hungary? What about Austria? What about the Czech Republic? Why did you guys stop after 4 countries? It's gone. How is it gone? How did influenza just disappear, poof, at the same time all over the world? That's remarkable. I start looking at these other causes of death for kids, for school-age kids. I'm looking at 0 to 14. And I start to realize, wait a second, more kids have died from asthma than from coronavirus? That's another one. A little hard to swallow that one, Dr. Fauci. And then the other issue I have has to do with therapeutics. Here we are almost a year into this, and the only FDA-approved therapeutic is remdesivir. Am I wrong about that? The only FDA-approved therapeutic treatment for somebody who has tested positive is remdesivir. There's no other approved treatment.
I think it's because the Gilead made the application not only for emergency use, but also made the application for approval, which they can do if they choose to. I don't know if all of the other companies that got emergency use authorization are going to go through the same lengthy, costly process of getting approval, because they essentially are getting the end product of what they want, which is their product used.
We'll come back to that in a minute. But the net of it is, if you test positive for coronavirus, all right, so let's say I'm one of your patients and I come into your place and I've got a fever, I've got all the symptoms, right? And you test me and I test positive. There's no FDA-approved therapeutic that you can, you're my physician, you can prescribe off, right? I mean, like, you can prescribe other things, but...
It's off-label. Yeah, it's all off-label.
But there's no FDA-approved therapeutic for coronavirus right now other than remdesivir, right? So
I think that's correct.
So that's a fact. So then my question to Fauci is, well, this Pfizer vaccine, was that approved by the FDA? And I'm hearing a whole lot of real loosey-goosey terminology in the news. According to, it's not approved or licensed. It's authorized for emergency use, which is not approved. And so the question that I have for you as a physician is, if I don't consider that I'm in a high-risk group, right? Or let's say my wife is not in a high-risk group, and she wants to wait until the Pfizer vaccine is approved, or the Moderna, either one. How long do we estimate we will be waiting for the full clinical trial approval to complete, rather than the because emergency use, I got to sign something that says I realize it's emergency, etc. Right? I got to sign something. If it was fully approved and licensed, I might want to wait for that. Now the question is that another 6 months, 9 months, a year? I don't have no clue what kind of.
It may never happen.
All right, so that's something I think we need to discuss and know about more, right? The Moderna vaccine, same thing. According to Moderna, it's not been approved or licensed. It's authorized for emergency use. So so they give you clinical trial results, but the question is, are we still running the trials? Are we expecting that by summer, by Christmas, that it will have been approved and we will have more clinical trial results? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not hearing any talk about that.
The answer will lie in whether or not the applicant decides to put the process through for approval.
Okay.
So if they decide never to do that, then there would never be an approval of the. I'm not saying they won't do it. I'm just saying it's really up to them, because they have to make the application. From my understanding, I'm not an expert in this process. I'm learning just like you are. But my understanding is, it sounds like your understanding, which is that it's emergency use authorized. The burden of proof is similar. I don't know actually specifically where it would be different, but I know that the applications are different.
I'm just curious if they're still running the trials. In other words, are there 30,000, 40,000 people participating in trials globally, and they're expecting further results that they then will be submitting for that approval? And people might say, well, if that's the case, I might want to wait till the summer if that's when they're. I don't know the time frames for this kind of stuff at all.
So there are people in the studies and they are still looking at them for endpoints. They are still following those 30,000 or so people in those studies. Whether or not that will come to fruition in an approval application, I don't know that. But I can say this, that the problem that they're having in those studies is that it's an ethical problem, because you have a placebo control arm in that study. And those are real people. Those are individuals. Those could be friends or family. And,
they're being given a placebo.
And so should they be forced to stay as a placebo, especially when it seems as though the data is showing that this is efficacious? So the problem that they're having is that a lot of these placebo controls are wanting the vaccine.
Understood.
And so they're losing placebos.
Understood. All right. Interesting. All right. So that you understand, and so that the audience knows, the data that I'm about to show you and the charts I'm about to show you is all coming directly from the CDC's website. Now, they changed their website recently. I'd love to be able to take credit for it, but who knows why they would change it. But they've made some changes to it recently, but a lot of the data that I'm showing you came from the screen that you see right here just 2 weeks ago, February 17th. And what you see is that the CDC breaks down the coronavirus deaths by age group. Okay? And I don't know if I need to zoom in some more here on the slide. If you can you make out this left-hand side column where it says 1 to 4 or 5 to 14? Can you see that?
Yes, yeah.
All right, so if we look at 5 to 14, that's kindergarten to 8th grade, roughly. 7th grade, 8th grade, whatever that is. So what do they call that? K to 8 or whatever, right?
Yep.
What's the next column say? How many? All deaths involving COVID.
All deaths.
How many?
Correct.
How many?
72.
The entire country. So it's $180 billion to reopen the schools, and 72 kids are dead. And we close the schools. But more kids drown. More kids die from stroke. Stroke? I didn't even know kids had strokes. More kids are dying from stroke than coronavirus. More kids are dying from asthma than coronavirus. And we don't vaccinate kids for tuberculosis.
No.
And more kids are dying from asthma than coronavirus. And we don't vaccinate kids for tuberculosis. More kids are drowning. Should we spend the 180 billion on life preservers, or should we fill the swimming pools or close the beaches? Should we mandate crash helmets in automobiles? We got 1,089 kids died in automobile accidents. Should we mandate crash helmets like NASCAR? If you're younger than 18, you have to wear a crash helmet in the car, because we'll save 1,000 kids' lives if we do that. And if we spend 180 billion on life preservers and we buy a life preserver for every kid and we just mandate you have to wear your life preserver all the time because we don't know when you're going to drown. So you have to wear them all the time because more kids are drowning than are dying from COVID. So if we're talking about saving children's lives, I think we need to look at the swimming pools and the beaches, close them to kids, or get everybody life preservers, and you're going to need to wear them all the time. Just like a vaccine protects you from something all the time that you may or may not get. A life preserver protects you from something that you may or may not die from, right? But more kids are dying from drowning than from COVID, and more kids are dying from asthma than COVID. And more kids are dying from stroke than COVID, and we don't vaccinate kids for tuberculosis.
We screen,
Right, okay. So, who took down the CDC's coronavirus data? Oh, they did. Did they do that because I've been showing people how to do this? Oh, I don't know. 5 to 14, and we're going to chart all deaths involving COVID-19 against deaths from all causes. And then instead of showing it in percentages, I prefer to show it as the actual number. If we were to look at the little dashboards that I keep putting together, it seems that COVID is not the biggest problem in certain age groups. Meaning if we look at deaths from all causes versus COVID, age group by age group by age group, we've got bigger problems. We have significantly bigger problems. And as we get older, COVID becomes a bigger problem. And so I started to look at the population and started to say, so wait, who's really dying from this thing, right? And it turns out that down at the left side, we've got the kids. And the number of deaths is so minuscule it barely registers. And that what we see is the real lion's share of people that are dying, 65 and older. And the population, once we get 85 and older, there's twice as many women, almost, just about twice as many women in the United States as men. And you see the green is the population and the blue are the coronavirus deaths. So as the population is tapering down, as the population gets older, the deaths are going up. And the lion's share of the deaths, 65 and older. So the big question is, when we start talking about 25 and younger, 30 and younger, how many people are actually dying? And it turns out, not that many. Not that many. And it sort of then starts to beg the question, well, how come nobody reported this? How come it wasn't spun this way? So I started to produce these charts, and next thing you know, Laura Ingraham on Fox News starts tweeting my charts. Okay, and she sees and she's like, well, what the hell is this? There's 30-something kids dead in the country and they closed all the schools. So I start doing this and I'm looking at population versus deaths. And I realize that it's really impacting the elderly in a very dramatic way, right? That shouldn't be a big secret. But the degree to which it's not impacting younger people is really not that well understood yet. And then I start looking at comorbidities. And fortunately, the CDC provided us with a column of data called deaths involving COVID-19 and pneumonia, excluding influenza. And using that number, I'm able to, you either have influenza or you don't. So if they're going to tell me how many of the deaths did not have influenza, it's pretty easy to figure out how many did. And so I start calculating of all the COVID deaths, how many had influenza and how many didn't. And it turns out that more than 50% of the coronavirus deaths also have influenza. But we're not finding out until after they die. So this data is coming from the death certificates. And what happened, I believe, is that we became so myopically obsessed with COVID that we stopped testing for influenza, except the coroners didn't stop testing because this data.
Could you go back?
Sure.
Yeah, could you go back to that slide? That one there, yeah. So you're talking about the second and the third columns, right?
So the first column is 335. This was back in January, so this is about 6 weeks ago. And this says 335 were dead total. And then it says deaths involving COVID-19 and pneumonia excluding influenza.
Okay.
And so so you've got, so if I've got all deaths from COVID is 335, and then I've got deaths involving COVID and pneumonia, but take the influenza out, right? So excluding influenza, I've got 155. Well, then how many do I have with influenza? Now, all the way to the right, they give us this shell game number that's like deaths involving pneumonia, influenza, or COVID. It's what's with the or? I don't want either or. That's not helping me. So deaths involving COVID and pneumonia, excluding influenza, means that the number over to the left is all deaths with COVID. So that would be with comorbidities, all the comorbidities. And we're going to look at those comorbidities in just a second. But what's interesting is they gave us the breakdown by age group. So I
was just going to say one other thing on that second column. It could also be, and I'll just forget this later, that's why it could also be deaths involving COVID-19. The difference between the 155 and the 335 could be just deaths of COVID-19 without pneumonia.
Mm-hmm. Could be. Okay. Except that would be, so we know that there's only 6% of the deaths that are just COVID-19 with no comorbidity, right? We know that. So
it could be another comorbidity without pneumonia.
Right. But we were told at the beginning not to compare COVID to influenza. So why are they conflating them in the COVID system? Why are you not comparing deaths involving COVID-19 and pneumonia and zoster virus? Why is that not?
These could have been, a priori categories that they came up with, thinking that we would have an influenza season. I have no idea.
All right, so I can tell you very specifically. There is an influenza mortality system that is the P&I mortality system for tracking influenza. This is the new system that they built just for COVID. So why did they add influenza? We have an influenza system. I have a system for which I'll show you in a minute. What the hell did you add it to here? Why don't you add measles to this one too? While you're at it, add hantavirus, rotavirus, throw tuberculosis in here. I don't understand why they did it, but when they did it, they gave it to me by age group. So I can tell you for each age group who's got influenza and who doesn't. Thank you, CDC. You just kind of admitted a little bit of monkey business here. All right, so they tell us by age group, and they're telling you, well, here's the people that don't have it. Okay. Well, another question. What about chromosomes?
Mm-hmm.
How come nobody knows this? 45 to 54, 35 to 44. You've got one group, one sex is dying twice as much as the other. If I told you that women are dying twice as much as men, we don't want to know about that? How is this not a story? Why is no one discussing this? This is pure data. This is straight from the spreadsheet. That's all this is. Right? I'm not a doctor. I'm a data guy. I don't need a stethoscope to tell you one is twice the other. This is not a doctor thing, right? I'm not doctoring right now. I'm doing data.
Yep.
Right?
Actually, I was actually interviewed by GQ on a story that they did about why men are dying more of COVID-19 than women, and that was months ago. So,
and to what degree did they understand that it was 2 to 1?
I don't know if I don't remember the actual numbers at that time, but it was enough to get a story out. It was significant.
Did they put a number to it?
They did, but I can't remember that. And it was about 4 or 5 months, probably more than that, 6 months ago.
Okay. So, but it's still not a story, and we don't want to know why. Right? We don't want to know why that is. And if it was flipped, if it was vice versa, you wouldn't hear Oprah and Ellen and everybody would be ranting and raving about it, and we wouldn't have like a different. There wouldn't be a different approach.
GQ, so yeah.
All right. So, but again, did they put a number to it? Did they say it's 2 to 1? And then
I have to look it up.
I'm sure they didn't. I'm sure they didn't, because if they understood that it was this dramatic, they would have done something about it, or somebody would have. If we go back to when the WHO declared the global health emergency, if we roll back to a year ago, right? The issue was, I'm looking at who's dead in the most populated countries on Earth. And I'm wondering, why are you declaring a global pandemic? I'm looking in Pakistan. I'm looking in Nigeria. I'm looking all over the world in March of 2020. And I see an outbreak in Wuhan. That's what I see. There aren't 10 people dead in Shanghai, Doctor.
Yeah, those numbers are I don't know. They're when it first came out, everybody said, "You don't believe those numbers, do you?" And then they're way too low. They're way too low. And then it came out here in the United States, and they said, "You don't believe those numbers, do you? They're way too high."
Well, this is
way too high.
So this is from Johns Hopkins. This is the Johns Hopkins map. And according to the WHO, and according to Bruce Alward at the WHO, and according to Bill Gates, this is legit. There aren't 10 people dead in Shanghai, but CNN doesn't want you to know that. There aren't 10 people dead in Beijing, but ABC News doesn't want you to know that. Ohio has 17,000 people dead, but Ethiopia has 2,300 dead. Okay? Connecticut has 7,600 dead, but Ethiopia has 116 million people. You see, Connecticut doesn't, right? Connecticut doesn't have 116 million people. Connecticut has 7,600 dead. Ethiopia has a fraction of that. This is where it falls apart, Doctor. You need a map. You need a map guy. You need a map guy who knows data. And you're looking at him.